June 22, 1941, 3:47 a.m. Kremlin, Moscow. Joseph Stalin stood frozen at his desk, telephone receiver pressed to his ear, listening to reports of German artillery pounding Soviet positions along a 1,000-mile front. Across the room, Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD and one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union, watched his leader with calculating eyes. The German invasion had begun exactly as Beria had warned it would, despite Stalin's explicit orders to ignore intelligence reports of troop buildups. For months, Beria had been collecting evidence of German preparations while Stalin insisted it was all British misinformation designed to drag the Soviet Union into premature war. Now, as explosions echoed across the western border, Stalin faced the terrible mathematics of being wrong about the intentions of Adolf Hitler. The man he had trusted least had been proven devastatingly right. The relationship between Stalin and Beria was unlike any other in the blood-soaked hierarchy of Soviet power. While other officials trembled and agreed with every word from the General Secretary, Beria possessed a unique combination of useful brutality and intellectual independence that made him simultaneously indispensable and dangerous. Born in Georgia like Stalin himself, Beria had risen through the ranks of the secret police by demonstrating an almost scientific approach to terror and control. Where other NKVD leaders relied on crude intimidation, Beria collected information with the precision of an entomologist cataloging insects. He understood that knowledge was power, and that even Stalin could be wrong when ideology clouded judgment. Throughout the spring of 1941, Soviet intelligence networks across Europe had been reporting the same disturbing pattern. German divisions were moving east. Supply dumps were being established near the Soviet border, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were becoming increasingly bold. Beria's agents in Berlin, some of whom had been cultivating sources in the German military for years, reported detailed troop movements and logistical preparations that could only mean one thing. Hitler was preparing to break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The evidence was overwhelming, documented in hundreds of reports that landed on desks throughout the Kremlin. Railway traffic analysis showed massive eastward movement of German equipment. Aerial reconnaissance revealed new airfields being constructed within striking distance of Soviet territory. Intercepted communications spoke of something called Operation Barbarossa, in terms that suggested imminent military action. But Stalin had made his decision based on political calculation rather than military intelligence. The Soviet Union was not ready for war with Germany. The Red Army was in the middle of massive reorganization following the purges that had eliminated much of the officer corps. Industrial production was being redirected toward military needs, but the process would take at least 2 more years to complete. Stalin believed that Hitler, despite his rhetoric about Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevism, was rational enough to avoid a 2-front war while Britain remained undefeated. The German leader had proven masterful at achieving objectives through intimidation and bluff rather than full-scale military commitment. Stalin calculated that the troop concentrations were designed to extract economic concessions from the Soviet Union, not to launch an invasion that would commit Germany to fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. When Beria presented his intelligence assessments to Stalin in early May 1941, the meeting became a rare moment of open disagreement between the two men. According to records found in Soviet archives decades later, Beria laid out photograph after photograph showing German military preparations, while Stalin dismissed them as fabrications designed to provoke Soviet aggression. The tension in the room was described by witnesses as almost physical, two Georgian minds approaching the same data with completely different frameworks. Stalin saw British manipulation and German theater. Beria saw methodical preparation for the largest military operation in human history. The argument that followed revealed the fundamental difference between ideological thinking and intelligence analysis, between political theory and operational reality. Beria's position was supported by multiple intelligence sources that painted a consistent picture. Soviet agents in the German Foreign Office reported that diplomatic staff were being evacuated from posts along the eastern border. Military attachés noted that German forces were being resupplied with winter equipment, despite the approaching summer campaign season. Most significantly, intercepts of German military communications revealed detailed planning for operations deep inside Soviet territory, including specific objectives that could only be achieved through sustained offensive action rather than limited border adjustment. The intelligence was not only consistent, but also technically sophisticated, involving details about German equipment and tactics that would have been impossible for British intelligence to fabricate convincingly. The mathematical reality of German preparation was stark and undeniable to anyone willing to examine the evidence objectively. By June 1941, the Wehrmacht had assembled the largest invasion force in military history along the Soviet border. 3 army groups, comprising more than 3 million men, supported by 3 800 tanks, 7 0 artillery pieces, and 2 500 aircraft, were positioned for immediate action. The logistical infrastructure required to support such a force could not be concealed from competent intelligence services, and Beria's network was among the most competent in the world. Supply lines extending hundreds of miles into occupied Poland, fuel dumps capable of supporting armored divisions for weeks of sustained combat, and ammunition stockpiles sufficient for major offensive operations all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a defensive deployment or diplomatic pressure. This was preparation for total war. If you want to discover how a man whose job was terror and control became the voice of reason in the face of ideological blindness, please leave your like on this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the archives of power. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more episodes that reveal the human side of historical moments that shaped our world. Yet Stalin's resistance to Beria's warnings was not entirely irrational within the context of Soviet political culture. The General Secretary had survived 3 decades of revolutionary upheaval by maintaining absolute control over information and decision-making. Accepting intelligence that contradicted his strategic assessment would have represented a fundamental admission of fallibility that could undermine his authority throughout the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, Stalin had personal experience with intelligence manipulation during the purges, when confessions and accusations were routinely fabricated to serve political objectives. His suspicion of intelligence reports was partly based on his own knowledge of how easily such information could be manufactured or distorted to support predetermined conclusions. The bureaucratic dynamics of Soviet decision-making also worked against accepting Beria's warnings. Intelligence assessments that contradicted Stalin's established position put middle-level officials in an impossible situation. Supporting Beria's analysis meant implicitly criticizing Stalin's judgment, which could result in immediate arrest and execution. But failing to prepare for German invasion meant potential military catastrophe. Most officials chose the safer path of echoing Stalin's assessment, while privately hoping they were wrong. This created an echo chamber where contradictory intelligence was filtered out or reinterpreted to support the prevailing narrative, even as evidence of German preparation continued to accumulate. Beria's persistence in presenting unwelcome intelligence reflected his unique position within the Soviet system. As head of the secret police, he was one of the few officials with independent sources of information and the authority to pursue investigations without direct oversight from other departments. His agents operated throughout occupied Europe and maintained contacts within the German intelligence services that provided access to information unavailable through diplomatic channels. More importantly, Beria understood that his own survival depended on the survival of the Soviet state. Unlike other officials who could hope to protect themselves through political maneuvering, Beria knew that German victory would mean his personal destruction along with the entire Soviet leadership structure. The smell of tobacco, smoke, and sweat filled the Kremlin conference rooms during those final weeks before the invasion, as officials worked through endless meetings trying to reconcile contradictory intelligence reports with political necessity. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins representing German units whose positions were updated daily based on reconnaissance flights and agent reports. The atmosphere was thick with tension and uncertainty as career officials struggled to navigate between professional duty and personal survival. Outside, Moscow continued its normal routines, while inside the Kremlin, a handful of men grappled with information that would determine the fate of millions. The technical details of German preparation that Beria presented were overwhelming in their scope and precision. Luftwaffe airfields had been constructed within striking distance of major Soviet installations, positioned to achieve tactical surprise in the opening hours of any conflict. German artillery had been prepositioned to target specific Soviet fortifications, indicating detailed reconnaissance and careful planning. Most significantly, German logistics networks had been expanded to support sustained offensive operations rather than defensive positioning. The evidence suggested not only that invasion was planned, but that it was imminent and would be conducted with unprecedented scale and intensity. How many of you have ever faced a situation where you knew something was terribly wrong, but speaking up would cost you everything? These moments of moral courage are disappearing from our collective memory. Leave a comment now saying just truth over comfort. When you comment, you're not just engaging with history. You're honoring those who chose difficult truth over comfortable lies. Let's create a memorial to intellectual courage right here in the comments. Weather patterns in spring 1941 also supported Beria's timeline for German invasion. The mud season that made large-scale military operations impossible in Eastern Europe was ending, creating the dry conditions necessary for armored warfare. German forces would need to achieve decisive victory before winter, which meant attacking no later than midsummer to allow sufficient time for sustained offensive operations. The window for invasion was narrow and closing, which explained the urgency of German preparations that Beria's agents were observing along the border. Every passing week made German objectives more difficult to achieve, creating pressure for immediate action that supported intelligence assessments of imminent attack. The psychological dimension of the Stalin-Beria relationship during this period reveals the complex dynamics of authoritarian decision-making under extreme pressure. Stalin's refusal to accept inconvenient intelligence was not simply stubbornness, but reflected the fundamental challenge of maintaining absolute authority while making decisions based on incomplete information. Acknowledging that subordinates possessed better judgment than the supreme leader would have undermined the entire theoretical foundation of Soviet governance. The system required Stalin to be correct, even when objective evidence suggested otherwise, creating a feedback loop that prevented accurate assessment of external threats. Beria's approach to presenting unwelcome intelligence demonstrated sophisticated understanding of authoritarian psychology. Rather than directly contradicting Stalin's assessment, he framed his reports as confirming the need for vigilance against German duplicity. Intelligence about invasion preparations was presented as evidence of German unreliability rather than Soviet misunderstanding. This allowed Stalin to maintain his position about German intentions while still receiving accurate information about German capabilities. The subtle distinction between intentions and capabilities became crucial as the evidence of German preparation became impossible to ignore. Military preparations on both sides of the border created an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that was palpable to anyone stationed in the region. Soviet forces had been placed on limited alert status, ostensibly for training exercises, but actually in response to German buildups that could no longer be completely ignored. German reconnaissance flights became increasingly bold, probing Soviet air defenses and photographing military installations with impunity. Border incidents involving both armies increased in frequency and intensity, creating a pattern of escalation that suggested imminent confrontation. The smell of diesel, fuel, and gun oil permeated military bases on both sides as equipment was checked and rechecked for immediate deployment. The human cost of intelligence failure began to manifest even before the shooting started. Soviet forces along the border were caught between contradictory orders that reflected the political impossibility of acknowledging German threats while maintaining the fiction of ongoing cooperation. Units were instructed to prepare for potential hostilities while avoiding any action that might be interpreted as provocation. This impossible position left Soviet commanders unable to achieve proper defensive positioning without violating explicit orders from Moscow. The psychological strain on officers who could see German preparations with their own eyes while being ordered to ignore the implications created a crisis of confidence that would prove devastating when actual combat began. Communication networks that would be crucial in the opening hours of any conflict were left vulnerable due to the political impossibility of acknowledging the threat they faced. Soviet command and control systems were designed for coordinated response to external aggression, but implementing proper communication security would have required admitting that aggression was imminent. The same political constraints that prevented proper military preparation also prevented the defensive measures that might have minimized the impact of tactical surprise. This created a cascade of vulnerabilities that would amplify the effects of German attack beyond what objective military analysis would have suggested. Intelligence reports from the final weeks before invasion painted an increasingly urgent picture that even Stalin could not completely dismiss. German forces completed their concentration along the Soviet border while maintaining the pretense of normal diplomatic relations. Supply convoys moved eastward under cover of darkness, while German diplomats continued to discuss economic cooperation and territorial adjustments. The disconnect between German words and actions became so obvious that even officials committed to supporting Stalin's position began to express private doubts about the sustainability of the status quo. Beria's agents reported that German officers were receiving maps of Soviet territory and linguistic guides for communication with civilian populations, suggesting planning for occupation rather than limited military action. The final intelligence briefing before the invasion occurred on June 21st, less than 12 hours before German artillery would begin the largest military operation in human history. Beria presented Stalin with intercepts of German communications that included specific timing for the attack and detailed objectives for the first phase of operations. The evidence was so comprehensive and immediate that denial was no longer politically sustainable, even within the closed system of Soviet decision-making. Stalin authorized limited defensive measures while maintaining that German action was not inevitable. This partial acceptance of Beria's assessment represented a compromise between political necessity and operational reality that satisfied neither requirement completely. When German shells began falling on Soviet positions at precisely the time Beria's intelligence had predicted, the vindication was bitter rather than satisfying. The man who had been right about the most important military question of the 20th century took no pleasure in watching the consequences of ignored warnings unfold across a 1,000-mile front. Soviet forces, caught between incomplete preparation and tactical surprise, began the longest and costliest military retreat in modern history. Cities that might have been defended fell within hours. Armies that might have conducted organized withdrawal were encircled and destroyed. The intelligence accuracy that might have prevented catastrophe instead became a measure of opportunity lost and lives unnecessarily sacrificed. The aftermath of June 22nd transformed the relationship between Stalin and Beria from one of cautious cooperation to grudging mutual dependence. Stalin could no longer dismiss Beria's intelligence assessments without risking additional catastrophic miscalculations. Beria could no longer present unwelcome analysis without accepting responsibility for the consequences of accurate prediction. Both men understood that their personal survival now depended on their ability to work together, despite fundamental differences in analytical approach and decision-making philosophy. The war that Beria had predicted and Stalin had denied became the crucible that would test their capacity for effective collaboration under extreme pressure. Soviet intelligence networks that had provided accurate warning of German intentions were rapidly overrun by advancing Wehrmacht forces, eliminating many of the sources that had made Beria's predictions possible. Agents who had spent years developing contacts within German military and political circles were either captured or forced to flee, destroying carefully constructed networks that represented decades of patient intelligence work. The very accuracy of Beria's warnings ensured that the sources of his information would be among the first casualties of the conflict he had predicted. This created a cruel irony, where successful intelligence analysis contributed to the destruction of the intelligence capabilities that had made such analysis possible. The psychological impact on Stalin of being proven so dramatically wrong about such a crucial question created lasting changes in his approach to intelligence analysis and strategic decision-making. While he never publicly acknowledged the accuracy of Beria's warnings or his own role in ignoring them, Stalin began to demand multiple independent assessments of major intelligence questions rather than relying solely on his own political intuition. This represented a fundamental shift in Soviet decision-making processes, even though it was never formally acknowledged or institutionalized. The man who had demanded absolute deference to his judgment began to seek contradictory opinions, at least on matters of immediate military significance. Beria's vindication came at enormous personal cost that extended far beyond professional satisfaction. The accurate prediction of catastrophic events made him a permanent reminder of institutional failure and leader fallibility within a system that could not tolerate such admissions. His continued presence in the Soviet leadership represented an ongoing challenge to the myth of Stalin's infallibility, creating a source of tension that would persist throughout the war years. The man who had been right when it mattered most became a living symbol of the political impossibility of acknowledging inconvenient truth within authoritarian systems. The broader implications of the Stalin-Beria intelligence dispute extended far beyond their personal relationship to fundamental questions about information processing in authoritarian regimes. The systematic filtering of unwelcome intelligence created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through careful analysis of public statements and policy decisions. German intelligence services correctly assessed that Soviet leadership would be reluctant to acknowledge evidence of impending attack, allowing Wehrmacht planners to achieve strategic surprise despite obvious preparation. The political constraints that prevented Stalin from accepting Beria's warnings also prevented effective defensive preparation, creating a cascade of tactical vulnerabilities that amplified the impact of German aggression. Military historians studying the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa consistently identify intelligence failure as a crucial factor in the scale of initial Soviet defeats. While German forces possessed significant advantages in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine, these advantages alone cannot account for the magnitude of Soviet losses during the first months of the conflict. The inability to achieve proper defensive positioning due to political constraints on acknowledging German threats created conditions that transformed tactical surprise into strategic catastrophe. Units that might have conducted organized withdrawal were caught in positions that made effective resistance impossible, leading to encirclement and capture of entire armies. The human cost of intelligence failure during the opening weeks of the German invasion was staggering in its scope and immediacy. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed before they could implement defensive plans that required acknowledgement of German intentions. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured while their leaders struggled to reconcile contradictory orders with obvious tactical realities. Civilian populations in border regions were abandoned to German occupation when military commanders could not implement evacuation procedures that presupposed an invasion everyone knew was coming, but could not officially acknowledge. As the war progressed and initial German advantages were gradually overcome, the question of intelligence failure during the invasion's opening became a subject of careful historical revision rather than honest analysis. Soviet accounts of the period emphasized German numerical superiority and tactical surprise, while minimizing the role of political constraints on proper military preparation. Beria's accurate warnings were either ignored in official histories or reinterpreted as evidence of his loyal service rather than Stalin's analytical failure. This historical revisionism created lasting confusion about the actual causes of initial Soviet defeats and prevented institutional learning that might have improved future intelligence analysis. The relationship between Stalin and Beria evolved throughout the war years into a complex partnership based on mutual necessity, rather than trust or ideological agreement. Stalin's recognition of Beria's analytical capabilities made him increasingly dependent on intelligence assessments from the man whose warnings he had initially dismissed. Beria's understanding of his unique position within the Soviet hierarchy allowed him to present unwelcome analysis more effectively by framing it in terms of loyalty to the state rather than criticism of leadership. This dynamic created a feedback loop where accurate intelligence became more politically acceptable as the consequences of ignoring it became more obvious. Post-war Soviet analysis of intelligence failures during the invasion period was constrained by the same political considerations that had prevented proper preparation before the attack. Official investigations focused on tactical and operational factors while avoiding examination of decision-making processes that might implicate senior leadership in systematic analytical failure. The accuracy of Beria's pre-war warnings was acknowledged indirectly through his continued prominence in the post-war security apparatus. But direct discussion of Stalin's role in ignoring those warnings remained politically impossible throughout the Stalin era. This created a historical record that obscured the actual dynamics of Soviet decision-making during one of the most critical periods of the 20th century. The technical aspects of intelligence collection and analysis that made Beria's warnings possible represented sophisticated understanding of German military planning and logistical capabilities that few contemporary observers possessed. Soviet intelligence networks had spent years developing sources within German military and industrial organizations that provided access to information unavailable through diplomatic channels or open-source analysis. The integration of multiple intelligence streams into coherent assessments required analytical capabilities that exceeded those of most contemporary intelligence services. This made the political rejection of Beria's analysis even more significant, as it represented the dismissal of exceptionally high-quality intelligence for purely ideological reasons. The long-term consequences of intelligence failure during the German invasion extended far beyond the immediate military disasters of 1941 to influence Soviet strategic thinking throughout the Cold War period. The recognition that political considerations could prevent accurate assessment of external threats led to the development of intelligence analysis procedures designed to provide leadership with unwelcome information through indirect channels. The institutional memory of catastrophic miscalculation influenced Soviet approach to intelligence sharing and decision-making processes for decades after Stalin's death. The man who had been proven right about the most important question of his era became a model for intelligence professionals who understood that accuracy might be more important than political acceptability. Lavrenti Beria's post-war career was shaped by his reputation as the man who had accurately predicted the German invasion when Stalin had dismissed such warnings as impossible. His continued prominence in Soviet security apparatus reflected Stalin's recognition of his analytical capabilities, even though this recognition was never acknowledged publicly. Beria's intelligence networks, rebuilt after the devastating losses of the invasion period, became crucial sources of information about Western intentions during the emerging Cold War. His understanding of the political dynamics that could lead to intelligence failure made him a valuable advisor on matters where ideology and analysis might conflict. However, his role as a living reminder of Stalin's fallibility also made him a potential threat that would ultimately contribute to his downfall after Stalin's death in 1953. The personal relationship between Stalin and Beria after June 22, 1941, was forever marked by the unspoken acknowledgment that the subordinate had been correct when the leader had been catastrophically wrong. While Stalin never publicly admitted his error, his increased reliance on Beria's intelligence assessments represented a practical recognition of analytical superiority that violated the theoretical foundations of Soviet political culture. This created ongoing tension between personal necessity and ideological consistency that influenced their interactions throughout the war years. Beria's careful navigation of this tension demonstrated sophisticated understanding of authoritarian psychology and the limits of even absolute power when confronted with objective reality. The broader lessons of the Stalin-Beria intelligence dispute remain relevant for contemporary analysis of decision-making in authoritarian systems. The systematic exclusion of unwelcome information creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by adversaries who understand the political constraints on accurate intelligence analysis. The human tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm existing beliefs becomes more dangerous when institutional structures prevent consideration of alternative interpretations. The case demonstrates that even the most sophisticated intelligence capabilities are worthless if political considerations prevent their effective utilization in decision-making processes. The historical irony of Beria's vindication lies in the fact that being proven right about the most important question of the 20th century ultimately contributed to his downfall rather than his elevation. His accuracy in predicting German intentions made him a permanent reminder of leadership fallibility within a system that could not tolerate such reminders. The knowledge that he had been correct when it mattered most gave him a form of moral authority that was incompatible with his subordinate position in the Soviet hierarchy. This created an ongoing source of tension that would influence his relationship with Stalin's successors and ultimately contribute to his execution in 1953. The technical sophistication of Beria's intelligence analysis during the pre-invasion period represented the culmination of decades of patient network development and methodical information collection. Soviet agents had infiltrated German military and industrial organizations at levels that provided access to strategic planning documents and logistical preparations that revealed the scope and timing of German intentions. The integration of human intelligence with signals intelligence and photographic reconnaissance, created a comprehensive picture of German capabilities that exceeded what most contemporary intelligence services could achieve. This made the political rejection of his analysis even more tragic, as it represented the waste of exceptional intelligence capabilities for ideological reasons. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about intelligence analysts who spoke truth to power, leaders who faced impossible choices, and individuals who understood that accuracy matters more than political convenience. Real people, real courage. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Russia, Germany. Our community extends around the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if anyone in your family served in intelligence or military service. Just tell us you're here. Thanks for watching, and thanks for ensuring that Lavrentia Beria's accurate warnings aren't forgotten in the silence of historical revision. These moments of intellectual courage deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible.